Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to join you today, and congratulations on your anniversary. It's been a great pleasure to work with Regina so far. Keep up the great work. So as Tim already introduced me, my name is Margarita Ravinskaya, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Cornell Institute of Occupational Health in Amsterdam. And the aim of my PhD research is to develop a core outcome set for work participation. Today, I'm going to talk about what exactly is the problem with core outcome or with outcome measurements. From whom is it the problem? I'm going to show some specific examples of issues with outcome measurements. I will explain how core outcome sets help and show how core outcome sets are developed. And I will close with current ongoing work for the development of the core outcome set for work participation, which we call abbreviated COS for work. So a lot of research is done within insurance medicine and occupational healthcare about finding out what helps people to get back to work or to stay at work, or for people who want to enter the employment market despite of a health problem. And we do research ourselves, or we synthesize, we combine available research to find answers to our research questions. But this is sometimes a difficult task for researchers in our field because of many different types of outcomes that are used. As you can see on the right, here are some examples of outcomes that can be found in occupational health research, such as return to work, productivity, workability, vocational status, sick leave, absenteeism, functional impairment. So it can be very difficult to really compare results and to make clear conclusions if you have 20 different outcomes for a similar research question. How can you put them together? So in the last couple of decades, there has been a shift in the medical community and in research community from just focusing on the medical issue towards a more holistic approach. A lot of you will probably recognize the International Classification of Functioning, of which participation is one core domain. Well, we recognize that this is important to include as well in our research, and as well to help patients in other areas of their life. But participation involves a lot of things. So we need to know what we should focus on in research. So let's take, for example, Mrs. Verhoeven. She could be a patient in a occupational physician practice. She's 42 years old, and she fell, and due to this trauma, she experiences a rotator cuff disease. Well, she experiences a number of problems. For example, she has pain, she sleeps badly, but she's also has trouble taking care of her children. She has trouble returning to work, and she also has, well, experiences emotional disbalance due to all of these things. So these are all different areas in her life which are impacted by the disease. And how do we decide what research should focus on? What is important for patients, employers, and social security? This is a design of a randomized controlled trial. This is the best available experimental method that we know to show effectiveness of interventions. So you start with a comparable population who experience a health problem. You compare it to an experimental intervention that you think will help with the improvement. You compare it to a control group, and then you decide which kinds of outcomes that you want to measure. So, for example, return to work. Perhaps you've also experienced this in your practice when you try to find the answer in evidence, what would help your patient with a certain problem, and you find that there are a lot of studies that are available, sometimes hundreds. And well, how do you know which study to choose? which study to base your conclusion or advice on, especially if the studies seem, well, a little bit different, or the results seem to be different. Well, for this aim, systematic reviews are performed. Systematic reviews are done so that evidence can be compared and synthesized. So you start with the research question, and then you look for available studies which fit the criteria. You assess the quality of these studies. You look for the best available studies with high quality. And then you try to combine the outcomes of all these studies, international, if that's applicable. And ideally, you perform a meta-analysis. And a meta-analysis is a quantitative comparison of results and outcomes. But of course, you can only do this if the outcomes are comparable enough. And then based on this, you are able to make a conclusion and suggestions for practice and for research. Unfortunately, within our field and in some many other fields for which core outcome sets are not developed, outcomes are really difficult to compare. Let's go back to the shoulder problem. This is a results of a review which was done on shoulder disorder trials. So you can see that they found 32 different types of outcomes that were measured in these trials, ranging from pain to range of movement, strength, dislocation, fracture, and 319 different instruments were used. So you can imagine it's just difficult to make comparisons in such a case. Now, I talked about participation before as a domain, and work is, of course, a part of the participation in your daily life. But what falls under this umbrella term of work participation, what is actually measured, we see that there are different types of outcomes that are measured. They can range from employment status to return to work, to functional status, to productivity, presenteeism, work functioning, health-related quality of work life, and there are a lot of subjective measurements such as motivation to work or readiness for work. If we zoom in on just one of these type of outcomes, return to work, what do researchers consider as return to work? When you look at what exactly do they measure, when is an intervention, when do they consider it to be successful? You see that there is actually a lot of variety even for this one concept, such as sometimes it's necessary to return to full-time work or part-time work, or to your own work, exactly what you did before, or adjusted work, or work another job, or just back to the employment market. And for how long should a person be back at work to consider the intervention successful? This also, there's a difference in this. So in some studies, it's enough to be back at work for 1 day. And sometimes it's, well, you have to work for 1 month or 4 weeks or 3 months without any sick leave. So quite a big differences. And of course, they all impact how, what kind of conclusions you can make. Another type of return to work outcome measurement is that people stop receiving social transfers. So they stop receiving disability funds or sickness absence benefits from the government. So when people stop claiming this benefit, then researchers consider that people have returned to work. Now, how is information on outcomes collected? Again, staying with the return to work, you can see that social security registers are used, so from the government. Sometimes researchers report that the phone call was made, or a physician report, or sometimes a patient to a self-report. Specifically designed questionnaires are used to measure work participation, and a lot of the times researchers just develop a question or a questionnaire to measure the outcome. So to what extent do these sources provide equally comparable information? And does a clinician report have the same validity as a patient's self-report? And what should be the best source of data collection? These are three examples on how work functioning or productivity is measured. So these are three questionnaires, and there are many more. And so if you are doing a systematic review and you want to know what helps people to stay at work, and you have 20 different types of questionnaires, and and to what extent are they comparable? To what extent is work productivity the same as occupational functioning and workability? So you really need to have good insight into all of these questionnaires in order to make proper judgment. This is sometimes hard because, well, it will take a lot of time, and a lot of times the information on the questionnaire is also not available. So it would be really ideal if researchers would also use one type of questionnaire for a similar outcome. So now on to the core outcome set. So this is a definition of a core outcome set. A core outcome set is an agreed set of standardized outcomes that should be measured as a minimum in all clinical trials. This is a definition by the COMET initiative. The COMET initiative was created in 2010 in the UK, and with the aim to encourage evidence-based core outcome set development. They provide guidance on the development of core outcome sets, so this is also done in a standardized way. They have a database with over 300 core outcome sets, which are registered for all types of health problems, and this is publicly available. So how are core outcome sets made? Well, once you have established that there is really a big variety in how outcomes are measured, and that a core outcome set would be beneficial, you need to find agreement amongst the most important stakeholders on what is really the most core or what is the most important to measure. And according to the COMET guidelines, these stakeholders are usually patient representatives, clinicians, and researchers. And usually this consensus round, there are usually several rounds with voting until agreement is achieved. Another aspect of this consensus round also involves talking about specific definitions of what these outcomes actually mean. For example, it may turn out that a quality of life or emotional well-being is seen as a very important outcome for a specific group or health problem. Well, then you need to really reach consensus on what exactly that means, and this can also take a lot of time, and it turns out to be difficult in practice sometimes. But once you have agreed on what it is that you want to measure, that everybody could or should measure, the next step is to find the best measurement methods to measure this. So the best clinimetric measurement instruments that everybody can use and measure in the same way at the same time. And in the end, this would contribute to standardized outcome measurements, and authors of systematic reviews would be able to compare and combine studies on a much larger scale, which would also, this is not only beneficial for systematic reviewers, but also for guideline developers and policymakers. So other advantages of core outcome sets are that you are much more likely to measure appropriate outcomes, because during the consensus process, you involve all the relevant stakeholders, and you reduce selective reporting, which sometimes happened when a team set out to collect information on several outcomes, but in the end decide to publish the results on only one of the outcomes or leave some outcomes out. This sometimes happens when the findings for some outcomes are different than what the researchers hope for. So of course this results in research waste and possible duplication of efforts in the scientific community. So we would really like to prevent this. And if you use a core outcome set, then you agree that for sure you're going to measure something. Yeah. So how are core outcome sets made? This is an example of a developed core outcome set for shoulder disorders. So first they established that there is a great heterogeneity. They had several rounds of consensus process with shoulder trial experts, clinicians, and patients. And this is the end result. The inner circle are outcomes that should always be measured in all trials in this health area. The middle circle are highly recommended but optional outcomes, because sometimes depending on the research question or the context, it's not possible to include these outcomes, but they are highly recommended. And the outer circle are recommendations for further research in this field, because not enough is known yet in this specific topic. So these are our collaborations, Cochrane Insurance Medicine, Cochrane Work, and UK Centre for Musculoskeletal Health and Work. So we have an international team. And I explained what the COMET initiative is for. And the COSMIN is an initiative, and they have developed a methodology to evaluate the clinometric the clinometric validity and quality of all the measurement instruments. So when you're doing the second step of the core outcome set development. So the aim for our cost for work is to develop an internationally applicable core outcome set for any type of health problem. So depending, it does not, it's applicable to any health problem, because we see that, well, there are similar types of outcomes which are used irrespective of the problem. The main users of this core outcome set will be authors of effectiveness studies and systematic reviewers. The population of the people of the interventions are either workers who experience a health problem or people who want to get paid work. So this is, we focus exclusively on paid work, not voluntary work. And the core outcome set is going to be applicable for studies that have a primary aim to improve work participation. So that have really have it as the main goal, but also studies that may be clinical or medical and measure it as a secondary goal or as a fifth or 10 outcome, such as surgery or pharmaceutical trials that have a very different aim, but included because they think that, well, perhaps it might also be beneficial for the work participation. So our ongoing work for development of the core outcome set. First step is to create a framework for work participation outcomes. As you are probably aware, there are different work-life stages and health problems, and they require very different types of measurements. And measuring if someone who has never worked and if they are ready to enter the employment market requires very different intervention than people who have rheumatoid arthritis and want to stay at work, or people who have been on sickness absence for a very long time due to cancer, but have recovered and want to get back to work. So there are very different types of interventions which require different outcome measurements at different time points. So in order to include and structure all relevant types of outcomes, we are creating a framework with main key constructs that are relevant for work participation. We are doing a systematic review to show, well, how is work participation measured internationally, which outcomes are used, which measurement instruments are used. We looked at studies from 2014 to 2019. They were, well, randomized controlled trials with primary aim of improving work participation, but also other types of aims, so such as medical trials with all health problems. We found a lot of studies, over 20,000, which we screened, and in the end we analyzed 286 RCTs, and we found a lot of heterogeneity, so core outcome sets definitely would be helpful. And we found that the outcomes could be grouped in 4 main categories: employment status, absence from paid work, at work productivity loss, and employability. And we are also doing a survey amongst the authors of these trials that we had included in our review, because we saw that in the randomized controlled trials, authors did not always explain why they chose specific outcomes or why they chose specific measurement instruments. And this could be valuable information for the development of our cost for work. And we also would like to know what are their experiences with various measurement methods. Would they recommend it for everyone's use or not, and why? And of course, because the authors of randomized controlled trials and systematic reviewers will be the end users of the core outcome set, we would also like to know their well, their ideas on the barriers and facilitators which they see for the development and implementation of our core outcome set. So after we have, we will be finished with these 3 studies, we will start with the consensus process, and we expect that the core outcome sets should be available by mid or end 2022. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. Are there any questions?